Good day and welcome to yet another episode of the Constitution in Action podcast. Today we're graced with a very, very special guest, a young person. His name is Thaafir Mustapha. Thaafir is the founder of SoWeVote and a UCT law student. Now you may ask what SoWeVote is. SoWeVote is a youth-focused political education initiative created by Mr. Mustapha. It aims to combat voter apathy amongst young people by making politics more accessible and more understandable. It uses social media and amplifies political parties' agendas and policies, thus providing clear explanations of the political spectrum to help young voters make informed decisions. Thaafir, welcome.
Hi, Ismail. Thanks for having me.
So, Thaafir, thank you so much again for joining us today. And to start off, can you share with us a little bit about the journey that led you to create SoWeVote and how your team aims to educate young people about political parties? I can imagine it must be an enormous task, and you've done it exceptionally well. What's your secret?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'll answer your last question first. The secret is that we're all young people. We're all really passionate about what we do. This organization came about when I was still in high school, and a lot of my teammates were in high school as well. Essentially, we have always been active citizens, and we've been trying to give back. And I think one of the answers as well is that we're real big politics nerds. And yeah, so I found myself job shadowing with one of the members of parliament. And I was there and we were doing speech writing and we were doing things like that. And I asked once, I was like, who's the audience for this debate speech that they were going to have in the House? And the MP turns to me and she says, the audience is the people of South Africa. And I think it was the first time that I ever thought about that being a fact. So, I go back and I read over it and I think, okay, but who in South Africa is actually going to be reading through this and making sense of it? And I felt like I was alone out there, right? Because I'm 18 years old, I'm sitting in the parliamentary office and I'm wondering to myself, am I the only one that doesn't understand what's going on? But, when the audience was said to be the people of South Africa, I thought, no, something's got to change. And, the MP that I worked for, she was very open to the fact that, we should be changing things up to make it more accessible. We should be changing the language that we use, but not everyone's like that. And I thought that a big part of that was the function of age. And so I thought, what's the best way to get young people involved in their government, involved in the things that actually impact them on a day-to-day basis? And I thought, it's getting them to understand how it all works. And how do you capture interest? How do you get them involved in the first place? Well, you've got to be a registered voter. And so, as a result, SoWeVote was born.
Absolutely. And Thaafir, I absolutely agree with you. Being a young person in South Africa comes with many challenges of its own. Not only do we have a political landscape that's sadly very unfavorable to young people, an economy that's unfavorable to young people with probably the highest youth unemployment rate anywhere in the world, but you've just mentioned all of the significant challenges that come with being taken seriously as a young person. And I'm sure that SoWeVote must have experienced many, many challenges itself. Can you maybe just walk us through what some of the challenges were that you faced in establishing SoWeVote and then managing SoWeVote thereafter?
Well, we started, and it's crazy to think, we started around 2-3 years ago. And the first object was we want to get people registered to vote. So I'm not sure whether you know the story of where our name comes from, but it's not a coincidence. So we wanted something that was pointed and directed, but not too niche to restrict us from going into a long array of different political issues. And so we thought that the vote came to represent a big part of who South Africans are. And I'll explain why. So we vote is a punchline. We are the punchline to the normal ramblings and rantings about why someone maybe doesn't believe in the systems that we have. So, this in the past there were load shedding, there was inequality, unemployment, that kind of stuff. So we vote. It implies that you need to get involved in order for things to change for the better or for the worse. It also shows that we've got a commitment to the people that are outside of the political space. It's not just an echo chamber for people that are involved in politics. It's there to try and become something that you can become acquainted with regardless of what level of political education you have. And so that was really our mission. But on the other hand, SoWeVote is one word, and it's there so that when at a glance you might think it's got something to do with Soweto, and it does. We're thinking about the Soweto uprising. It was a time where young people in this country came together and they fought against a system that they truly believed was unjust. And when they did, people took note, right? And I suppose that's the best way I can say it, because apartheid didn't end immediately after. It took another 15 years to have Mandela released and another 3 before we had our first election. But historians credit what the kids did at that day, and they were a lot younger than I was. They credit what they did because they gave their lives for something that they believed in, and it caused the rest of the world to look on and take inspiration, and it moved the needle in terms of how people responded to oppression in this country. I think that if we're going to get out of oppressive circumstances in this country, it's going to take young people standing up and being at the front again. And this time, they don't have to give their lives, they just have to give their time and parts of their heart in order to do that. And, it's not going to be overnight. It took 15 years for the kids at Soweto to see a future that they could grow up in and prosper from. And it's going to take us showing up at every election. It's going to take us being involved, being aware, being conscientized towards the fact that the world around us includes us. What problems we found at SoWeVote was when we were registering people, they were saying stuff like, well, I don't feel educated enough to register to vote. I shouldn't be voting. Well, they said, I don't believe that the government does X, Y, Z for me, and so why should I vote? Because nothing's going to change. And essentially, the problem that we have is that we're trying to work against the political culture. I believe, in no uncertain terms, that the political culture needs a complete overhaul and redoing. Right? We were once a country based on hope, where people could keep going even after they got knocked down. And I still believe that South Africans have that resilience within them. I think that how we channel that energy needs to be reorganized. So for instance, when we think about how we're getting on in our day-to-day lives, how often do we think about politics affecting that? We look at the rising prices of groceries or the cost of living, for example, and we tell ourselves, oh, but it's because I don't work hard enough. It's because, I didn't do this and I didn't do that. Why aren't we looking also at the systems that govern our lives? And so the reason why we chose voting as our main focus was because it's really a microcosm of what we want people to do. You need to cede some of your individual power to the collective in order to go forward. Sometimes you can't fix things on your own, and that's okay. As a collective, we've got a lot more strength, and as young people, we're not short of numbers, and we're not short of strength, we're not short of time. As a country, we can move forward when we go together, and we want people to start looking out for their neighbors. Your individual strength sometimes can only be brought forward when you're in a community that are involved, because people fought long and hard for this. That's true. What is for someone that's, not enjoying the fruits of what was fought for? We're not looking to write them off. We're not looking to write off people that believe in misinformation or conspiracy theories. We want to meet them where they are. And that's something that I believe we're trying to model for the political classes. They need to meet young people where they are instead of expecting young people to come to them. We have overcome a lot of the apathy by making sure that we use language that young people are using in order to get the message across. We're trying to make politics fun, which is a hell of a task, but I think that we're getting some way if, our following rate is anything that we can judge it by. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was making that we really validated people's feelings before we started preaching about the merits of voting. It's about connecting with people, it's about listening to them, and it's not teamwork.
Now, Thaafir, I like that you really took us back to youth involvement, for example, in June 16th, right, with the Soweto uprising. And when we look from that time, we see youth really, like you mentioned, play a very integral role in the country's politics. Now, last year, we had a very interesting election in South Africa. I think we'll all agree with, it looked very different. Now, I wanted to ask, what role, what important roles did you see young people playing in the 2024 elections? So, speaking on youth engagement, so what did you, were you impressed by the way young people were involved in, the run up to the 24 election, involved in their politics, in their communities? Or do you believe that there could still be so much more that young people do regarding the political life of the country?
Well, I'm going to answer both questions with a yes. Right? I was impressed by how people were able to give interest to it. Right? We had people from all over the country, all ages, even people that weren't voting age yet, starting to ask questions about politics. That's really where it starts. We've made a big statement about saying your politics is your values. Right? Your values will evolve as you age. Therefore, your politics will evolve as you age. But it's making sure that you're using your heart and your mind when you're engaging with politics, because that ultimately is what drives policy at its core. Right? When it came to the election, I saw people, coming out to register, whether it was through our encouragement, whether it was on their own. I saw people speaking, at least engaging in the political discourse, whether it was on TikTok, Instagram, that kind of stuff. And for the mere fact that there were no shortage of youth organizations last year pushing for electoral change, I think that that's what contributed ultimately to the coalition. We had a new generation of young people coming up and saying, I'm not happy with the status quo, and it wasn't just here, it was around the world. People saying that they're not happy with the status quo. And when the parties in power listened and changed policy, we saw that incumbents were being retained. When we saw that people were really just sticking to their guns and saying, no, we're going to carry on as it was, that's when the status quo was chucked out. And I think that part of what happened in South Africa was a hybrid situation, right? We had new policy coming out from a lot of, different incumbents. We had as well a lot of new parties contesting for the very first time. And so we had as well this generation of people that had just never gotten involved before. And I think that, in a more social, online aware age, it meant that a lot more people were just going out there and going for it, But yeah, if you're asking about how much more they still have to contribute, like I said before, SoWeVote is built on the same premise as like the Soweto uprising. It's the fact that change is not going to happen overnight, but that doesn't mean that you don't get involved. Right? This first conversation that we need to have now was 2024. That's when people first were interacting with, well, what is it that I think about the economy? What is it that I think about social issues or like education and that kind of stuff? And when it became controversial, it brought a lot of people into the fold, right? But that's not a conversation you can necessarily always have with yourself just before an election. It's something that you've got to build over time. You've got a lot of well-intentioned people that may have voted for people that they didn't necessarily agree with because they couldn't distinguish between the political messaging, right? We're here to say it's not a sports team. You don't support them throughout. The party has to earn your vote. You as the voter deserve to be courted. You deserve to someone come to you and say, I'm here to get your vote and I'm here to listen to you and your experiences matter. It also means that there's an onus on our education system, on civil society as well, to say, we're coming to young people and we want to give you the tools to be able to make those decisions. Not to say, vote for this one or vote for that one, but to say, we're planting the seed for you to have that first conversation with yourself, right? Where is it that you land on the political spectrum? What is it that you think about the economy and things like that? And often it's because people haven't gauged young people's opinions on things like this before, that it continues. And I think that, the more we cling to this individualism of it's me alone, and my vote won't change the election, we're going to continue on a cycle where people are failing to introspect and find out what is it that's important to them. Because without a doubt, politics is going to touch everything that we do. And, no one's saying you have to join a political party, become a card-carrying member, or go to a rally. But we are saying, do some research. Find out what it is that, you're passionate about, and find out where, things are being touched by people that you don't know. I think everyone's got an interest in that. And yeah, I'm excited. I think there's a lot of energy and a lot of untapped potential in the younger generation. So I'm definitely excited to see what happens in 26. We heard a lot about 2024 is going to be our 1994. I think 2024 was our 1976, but that's not as sexy to say. And so people can say.
Yeah. Thaafir, can I just add this real quick? Ismail and I, especially within the Constitutional Advancement Program in the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, we actually picked up on this gap. That there's so many youth, right, whether it be in a high school classroom or in a university lecture room, that aren't fully aware of the Constitution. And I remember on the run-up to the election, that's when we started our constitutional advocacy, amongst youth, especially amongst university students. And I just wanted to share, interestingly, Ismail and I had an engagement in one of the schools, I think 2 weeks back. And the first thing Ismail asked the high school learners was, who knows what the Constitution is? And the response was quite shocking. Many people weren't aware of what the Constitution was. But you see, that becomes an opportunity, rather than seeing that or just being shocked and leaving it at that. We see it as an opportunity to educate young people on the Constitution. And I mean, these are the future of the country. And so by educating them, we are bringing up that next generation of South African citizens that know their rights, and that will do everything to protect democracy within the country. So,
yeah.
Absolutely. Thaafir, what you say is just so inspiring. And you mentioned the energy and the optimism. I have to say, your energy is contagious. All of us on this podcast are young people, and all of us share the same vision for a South Africa that wasn't heading in the right direction, but hopefully with our input, with our assistance, with our guidance in the work that we do, we can help steer it on the right path. So I have a few questions for you in that regard, because I'm not just inspired, but I'm curious as well. You mentioned the 2024 elections. Now, looking at the 2024 elections, I have to say, Thaafir, it was touted as this 1994 moment, but when we actually looked at the stats of who came out to vote, we saw that it produced probably the lowest ever voter turnout rate. And the young people make up the majority of people in South Africa. So I wanted to ask you then, is a higher voter turnout rate amongst young people one of your preeminent goals at SoWeVote? That's the first thing. But I see you, I hear you speak, and I'm listening to a youth leader. And the question really is, Thaafir, do you see yourself then graduating to a position where you yourself will want to someday stand to be a member of parliament?
Let me just say, SoWeVote wasn't founded with the idea it was going to become this mass movement. It was me sitting there thinking, I've had an interest in politics since I was maybe like 8 or 9 years old, probably, But for a lot of people, that's also not true as well, Whether you've got different interests or whatever, politics is going to touch your life, right? And you might not want to join a party, you might not want to get involved in that kind of way, but that doesn't mean that you don't care about your country. And we've got to stop treating it as such, Being political doesn't mean that you have to necessarily be in the fight or want to be president of the country. It just means that you care about the person that's next to you. Unfortunately, that has become a political statement. What I can say is that it took curiosity to bring us to this point, right? There's a lot of things in terms of this country's infrastructure that has to change in order to get young people to participate. One of those things being, how are we making it accessible for young people to get to the polls? Let me put it this way, right? We can't have inclusion without integration. And the reason why I say that is because we heard a lot from the IEC, from political parties, about the fact that the youth vote is critical. I don't know how much policy changes we saw about young people, though. Where was the inclusion on that? How many young people do you have in your highest decision-making bodies? I don't think there's a lack of them out there. I know a lot of really capable, qualified people, just by the fact that they're willing to get involved, share, and listen, brilliant people that have been cut out of discussions, whether it's within party settings, whether it's within civic society. They need to be there, And another thing that's maybe a little bit more practical, and I haven't seen anyone else speak about it, we had an election week, an election day, or I should say election week because there was early voting. We had it during a week where almost all university students and all high school students in matric who were able to vote were writing exams. You can't schedule an election during exam week and then talk about the fact that the youth haven't shown up. It's not okay. Small things like that, it's an oversight and we can write it off as that, but how much of that is because there aren't young people in the room making these decisions? And no one's saying that we need to be at the head of the table, but we need to be included, right? And we need to be treated as not even equals, but we need to have our voice heard, right? As the future of this country, it means that, and this is something that we speak about all the time, we have people that are there working towards policy in our government right now, setting agendas and goals for 2030 and 2050. They are in their 70s, and with all due respect, a lot of them will not live to see the consequences of the policies that they're enacting. The reason why I've become such a staunch advocate for young people to get involved is because if we don't act now, we ultimately will inherit a country when we come to an age where these things will directly affect us, right? Whether it be from the climate. We're going to need a planet to live on, whether it's the economy. A lot of people, and you said it before, South Africa needs to be redirected into a direction where we can progress from. But I'm not naive enough to think that young people all want the same thing. And you brought this up already. We don't all want the same thing. We've got different opinions. But it's the way, it's the attitude, it's the political culture that we find ourselves in. We need to be able to have the dialogue, And maybe that's different under a government of national unity. I surely hope it is. But there's a lot that needs to change. So, but to answer your second question, I haven't thought about it. I'm still in law school. And law school it's a lot. I think you can give me a break. Let's see what we do with the degree first before we start thinking about career opportunities. But
Yeah, at the FW de Klerk Foundation, these are exactly the types of dialogues, discussions, and debates that we like having, because sometimes addressing the critical issues facing us are uncomfortable. Like what you mentioned about having an election scheduled right slap bang in the middle of an exam week. But it's necessary that we coalesce around this issue and amplify our voices in unison so that those who are making decisions behind closed doors know that there is an active youth population that are unhappy with the way that things are going in South Africa. Another thing that we've been working on at the FW de Klerk Foundation recently is the issue of independent candidates standing for elections. Now, you'd know that a few years ago, we had the New Nation movement case before the Constitutional Court, wherein independent candidates were allowed to stand for elections. And the 2024 election was the first ever election where independent candidates were indeed allowed to stand. I think it speaks volumes that not one single independent candidate actually won a seat in parliament. And so we've been looking at things like our proportional representation system, which results in coalition governments. We looked at perhaps making recommendations for electoral reform to change that to a mixed member proportional system where you have constituencies and so forth. And in essence, what we're trying to do is trying to suggest changes to the electoral system so that independent candidates have a fairer shot at running for and winning a seat in our national legislature. Now, that all being said, I am worried, Thaafir, and maybe you can help me out with this. Why do we see so few young people stand as independent candidates? Is it because of all of the systemic issues that I've mentioned, or are young people simply complacent, uninspired, and have lost interest in politics as it stands?
Well, look, there's two ways this can go. I can either give you an analysis or I can give you an opinion. I'm going to try and do both. In terms of independent candidates, I think that it's a shock to our electoral system. When you have people that, are not already engaging in politics and with the system, trying something new is not often the way that they want to go, right? That's why you see new voters, they probably tend towards either parties that they find really appealing to them, or for a lot of people, the decision is, or was, I should say, before the GNU, two major parties in this country that they wanted to vote for. And that's because political culture is ultimately informed by what we see in media, right? And so many countries, for instance, do the two-party system. We can't escape not being influenced like that, So, I mean, when it comes to young people standing as independent candidates, what I can say is, I think that firstly, it's the fact that campaigns are expensive. You don't have party infrastructure backing you. There's the fear of the fact that, you put yourself out there and you lose. What do you do with yourself afterwards? It takes a lot of energy. But I agree with the sentiment, right? I've always said we don't necessarily need young people to represent us. I think that we just need a new way of thinking, right? Because ultimately, regardless of then who's in that seat, you'll see some positive changes. For example, we saw certain parties put really young members into positions, and ultimately it ended up being tokenism, right? They were put in there and hidden away, or they were put in there and those people were not representative of what I think South Africa's talents are. But that's unfortunate, because what it does for young people in this country who have the talent, who have, I want to say the experience, and a lot of people would argue with me on that to say, but you don't have the experience. The experience is having lived in this country. It's the daring to dream for something that we need in South Africa. That's, I would say, makes you qualified, right? But we didn't see it. I think for independent candidates, and I voted for independents because I know that they need every vote that they can get. I know you didn't ask about my opinion on the electoral system, but I'm going to give it anyway. I think that we should have a constituency-based lower house in our National Assembly, and I think the NCOP should be proportional, right? It should, I mean, they do it in Australia. They've got these constituencies, they've got people that they can rely on, people that they can answer to. Ultimately, we don't have a system where, like many other countries where independents are allowed to run, like Britain, New Zealand, the United States, where once you elect someone, that person is still very much involved in your community. They're advocating for your community issues. When we send people off to parliament, I feel like they disappear, right? They become part of the party arsenal, whatever. You don't see any sort of, discourse or disagreement or dissent with their party. And I think that that's unfortunate. What it does is it erodes what a community can contribute in the national dialogue. And so I think that it's recognizing that that system isn't favorable to people that are wanting to stand. And I think that young people know that we deserve better. So perhaps that contributes to the aversion, but that's just my thoughts on it.
Thaafir, you just mentioned now that as young people, we deserve better. And I fully agree. We know recently we had the 2025 State of the Nation address, and there's been a mixed reaction to it. Now, the address came at a very specific time where we know South Africa's economy is not looking the greatest. We know that in terms of foreign news regarding the country, we firstly have soldiers, our soldiers that are, you know, struggling in the DRC. Again, we also have comments coming from President Trump regarding, certain legislations in South Africa. And so, amidst all of this, I wanted to ask you how you think the State of the Nation address reflected the priorities and concerns of young people in South Africa. Because some people you could say that, with all these issues, that concerns of young people could have just been swept under, just trying to use the address to address so many other critical issues in the country. So how do you feel? Do you think it represented the priorities and concerns of young people or not?
Look, I think the fact that the president had to speak about every issue in an election where a lot more people were taking an interest means that he had to speak to youth problems, right? It was a broad speech. He didn't focus on a couple of things. I think he hit a lot of nails last night, right? And honestly, I think that on balance, it was a good speech, right? I'm not saying, for instance, that there were things that couldn't have been expanded upon a bit more. I'm just saying that in terms of making sure that a lot of the issues that we hold dear were brought up, I think that was done. I wish that we would have seen more in terms of things that spoke directly to young people, or that we, wanted certain policies to be included. But I think that we're on a trajectory where we can start having these discussions. For example, you did speak about university funding. You spoke about funding for higher education last night. My critique of the speech is more macro than it is micro. It's the fact, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, it's the political culture that we live in. But I think, South Africa, we expect our leaders to be accountable and transparent, and I think that also means being honest, even when you've fallen short of the mark. That's something that might even work in their favor, for the politicians to come up there and not say, oh, but we've done X, Y, Z over this time and that time, but rather to say, look, this is what we wanted to do. We did something, but we know that we fell short, so we need to continue, right? That's a more compelling argument than saying, okay, but don't focus on this, focus on that. How do you say that to someone who, last night when they brought up the fact that, X amount of people have been funded for higher education? What do I say to the people who are complaining and that are my peers and had to crowdfund in order to pay for their registration fees or pay off their fees from last year, or didn't get funded, even though they do have a need for it, It's the fact that we're not willing to mention that, right? So, I get it. The president has to come up there and he's got to give us an update on how the year went. And it's a factual statement, right? He's speaking about the fact that last year, X amount of people did get funding, and that's awesome. But we need to hear more about how are we expanding the things that work, and how are we revolutionizing the things that haven't yet gotten there. So on balance, I think it's a great speech. I think we're heading in the right direction where all the issues are being spoken about. In terms of policy, I think there's still lots to be desired. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. Listening to the State of the Nation address last night, I thought it was a very well elocuted, eloquent speech that was mixed with a tinge of optimism. And I felt relatively inspired. But upon closer reflection, I then thought to myself, well, we've got to break this political culture that you speak about. Because again, I'm worried, Thaafir, that the political culture in South Africa sets the wrong message for young people. You know, there are young people out there in South Africa, and I speak from personal experience, young people that I've spoken to, who want to go into politics because they think that that's the easiest way to becoming wealthy. Now, I want to get your opinion on how we break that political culture as young people, how we step aside as young people from the dogma that politics is the road to riches. That's the first question I'd like to ask you. But I'd also like to ask you something else. How do we allay the fears that young people can't simply go out and vote once every 5 years, that indeed they need to participate? What avenues are there for young people to participate between the election cycles? I'm sure SoWeVote has a lot of events or projects lined up. Could you maybe shed some light on what you have up your sleeve?
So, what I will say is, and it's a really important one, we've got to stop making politics compartmentalized. Right? Politics isn't just about the economy, it's not just about state agencies and all of the really, really, really long names that we give things in our government. No, I always bring it up. I mean, like, you're the Minister of Justice, but then you're never just the Minister of Justice. You're like the Minister of Justice and Cooperative, Constitutional, blah, 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 blah. And then you've got like 7 like deputy ministers as well. That turns a lot of people off, right? So, I mean, when you start speaking about politics, people are like, whatever. And I think that a lot of people in civic society get it wrong as well, right? We start speaking about dialogue and whatever, and we say, okay, well, we're going to get a space, right? And we're going to bring people to the space and we're going to talk and whatever. Why don't we go to them? Why are we not engaging with people through like basketball games or like soccer tournaments and things? They aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, you start speaking about stuff like immigration and it's all like way out of people's minds. Then you start speaking about the fact that like, oh, what are you going to do in the future? A lot of young South Africans are at the point where they say, oh, I want to move abroad because they think that it's so much better like in another place. They're all interrelated. When you speak about how you hate school and school is so bad, often it boils down to one of these issues that tie into a policy decision that's been made by the Department of Education. These things matter. How we speak to each other, how we address each other, it matters. Right? How we speak about people that we disagree with, that matters. Right? These are things that I would argue start at the top. And this is why when we're talking about changing the political culture, it's got to be multi-pronged. You spoke about SoWeVote projects, so maybe now's the time to tell you about some of our departments that we've got. So we've got our politics department, right? And what they do is they do all of the research in terms of issues that are going on, looking at the courts, legislation, the executive, putting it together into bite-sized, digestible pieces so that you can come on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, that kind of thing. You find the information as you're there. You don't need to come look for it. It's there. Because I mean, if I'm being honest, I grew up in a time where everything that I learned about politics came from being chronically online. It also came from things like watching political dramas because I thought that they were fun, and then like out of interest being, oh, I wonder how we do it here in South Africa. It's about streamlining it so that that kind of thing is easy to do. We don't have a lack of knowledge when it comes to these things. It's about getting it out there. Our policy team, however, on the other hand, works more on the advocacy side of our mission, which is targeting what can we change in the system now. For example, the way that the culture develops at the top will always trickle down. I grew up in a time where, Barack Obama was the president of the United States, for instance, and let's forget about policy at all. Just the man himself. Right? He was charismatic, he was funny, he was cool. Right? And he, at the same time, had a message of hope and he was, from a minority group. He had a funny name. It gave a lot of hope to people, and for me, growing up in that time, I can't say that didn't affect me, right? I looked at that and I thought, here's my name that most people can't pronounce properly. And I am in South Africa and blah, 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 whatever. Our leaders are people that we look up to, regardless of whether we think we do or not. And it can be a admiration, or it could be as a scapegoat. For instance, corruption, when it starts at the top, makes it so normalized at the community level. If the president can steal billions of rands, and get away with it, then why can't I buy my license, for instance? If these are the only ways that services get issued and things get done, then you're just participating in the system. We're talking about redefining that system. It's going to take people at the top and at the bottom, and we've got to meet in the middle somewhere. That's why dialogue is important. And it's about making sure that we leave behind all the mystery and mythology that we supposedly did away with in the 1960s when we abolished the monarchy, and we actually get into the dirty work of being a republic for all that that means. It means we the people, and it means that we've got to do it together.
Now, when we're talking about the practicality of this, because now we establish and know that young people need to be involved. Now, you've worked closely with politicians, as you've mentioned, and have seen firsthand how these policy decisions unfold. Now, maybe could you just let us know how young people can get involved, practically in pushing for these policies that would directly affect them, directly affect issues related to youth, like youth unemployment?
I would say find things that you're passionate about. And this is advice that can hold true for a lot of different areas pertaining to young people. You also don't need to think, you can think big. If you're experiencing a problem, chances are it's not just you, it's a lot of people, because it's systemic, right? In terms of getting involved, I would say you can be involved by being a good neighbor to other people, by being a good friend. That's really like on the micro level what it's all about, right? If we're really intentional about creating a new culture, it's about starting at the ground, on the ground, at the grassroots level, and moving it up. You need to be having conversations with your friends. Having conversations about your friends and their lives. It might sound wishy-washy and like hippie kind of stuff, but it makes an impact. The fact that you and your friend can speak about the fact that you had to take 2 taxis this morning in order to get to school, or the fact that you can't really go out because your parents have to work day and night because they don't have proper documentation, and so they get exploited by their workplace, kind of thing. Taking an interest in other people is how we get talking about these things. It's about how we start to recognize that things in our country are a problem. Don't be scared. Don't be afraid to complain. It can be easy to be scared about feeling isolated, but I think that's why getting involved often just means being brave enough to start and having a conversation. But if you're speaking about more practical terms, I would say Parliament is your house. Right? Write to your members, call them, get involved with organizations. No one's saying you have to join a political party, but speak to the civic organizations in your community that are addressing a need. Form a group on your own. And to young people, particularly in their teen years, I would say you don't need to have a formal organization with millions of bands in order to make a difference. Sometimes it's just a will and a way, through every sort of resource that you can put together, making sure that you can achieve something, and that on its own, I think is remarkable.
Well, absolutely. One thing that really caught my attention, Thaafir, listening to you, is you mentioned that sometimes we have too bloated a bureaucracy. You mentioned that we have the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development and so on and so forth, with multiple deputy ministers there under. Surprisingly, not many people in South Africa, not many young people in South Africa know that we do in fact have a Minister of Women, People with Disabilities, and Youth. Now, just your opinion. Do you think that this ministry should focus solely on youth? In other words, should we just have a Minister of Youth in South Africa? And then what do you think that ministry should be focusing on preeminently?
So the thing is, I feel like you could run the risk of making youth a separate topic when it's not. Right? Do young people not have a stake in the economy or education or business? Of course, it would be awesome to have a minister that is solely dedicated to these issues, but I would argue that, in a cabinet with like 70 odd people, surely, you could infuse that mandate to all of them. I think that would be a lot more effective if every minister had a mandate, come up with a policy for how your department will be impacting young people in South Africa. What is it that you're going to be doing, right? So, in terms of maybe centralizing it into the department or using the department that we have already, I would say, perhaps you've got to have people that are representative to these different departments going in there and advising, right? I think that currently we've got a minister that is doing a job, but in terms of mandate meeting with young people, definitely there's a lot left to be desired. It's not just about young people that are at university, it's about young people that are in rural areas, it's about young people that are working, it's about young people that are, involved in the civic space. It's about getting a feel for what it is that we want, and that's something that we've got to do. It's on us as well. We've got to show up to the election and really make our voices heard, but at the same time, we want to err away from tokenism, right? We want us to be included, and so I don't think that you should create a children's table for us. I think that you should just, in our existing structures, focus a lot more on making sure that young people are being promoted, recruited, given an opportunity.
I just want to pivot a bit towards international news.
Yes.
South Africa's been trending quite a bit internationally. And as I previously mentioned, we have the whole issue in the DRC, ridding our peacekeepers. Now, what might you think the broader implication of such an event has on South Africa's foreign policy, specifically like the role the youth play in shaping such policy? Because I would like to believe that it's even an issue that youth are becoming more acquainted with and more vocal about. So what do you see as the role of youth in developing or influencing such policies?
Well, look, I've spoken about it before, the fact that the world that we're going to inherit is the one that's being created right now. I definitely think that there's a lot of young people that are finding themselves in positions to speak on these kinds of things. When it comes to the everyday South African, I would say that the most important part is making sure that your voice is heard, right? So it's about contacting people that can make a difference. It's about mobilizing support. We saw last year and definitely the year before with student encampments on campuses around the world, it in some instances allowed for big institutions, universities that have got billions of rands in endowment to say we are going to be doing a boycott, right? Or to say we are going to take this step and that step. It forces a conversation and it makes a nation look on. Because I think that once you get started in politics, right, the logic will hold true throughout. So, you've got this principle that in order for me to be the best version of myself and have the most potential, that means that my neighbor's got to have as I do. Right? Because we're interlinked, we share part in whatever sort of oppression we find ourselves under. Once you've adopted that way of thinking, right, in terms of domestic policy, the next gradual step is to say, okay, now that we've dealt with this issue as a country, where are we looking beyond that? So I mean, in that way, I would say young people still have a lot to say, and things are going to evolve. I think that same as I said just before. Young people need to be part of those discussions, and the discussions need to be brought to them. We shouldn't be chasing, because I think that young people know that they deserve the proper representation, and I don't think they've ever been shy to fight for it.
Yeah, we're very lucky that one of the biggest global discussions is happening right at our doorstep, G20. G20 in South Africa has the honorable title of being president of G20 this year. Do you think that G20 provides that platform that Ezra spoke about now that young people can get involved in? How really can young people seize the opportunity of G20 coming to South Africa?
Well, I would say a lot's riding definitely on Y20. U20 with the fact that, the conversations that are coming out there now, we've got a chance as having everything that we've been asking for a while. But I mean, as a member of the Global South, as a majority black country, we've been asking for the kind of access or influence that we now will have. I think that as South Africans, we're extremely lucky. The fact that we do have this kind of international presence, right? That also means that while we have that right, we do ultimately have a responsibility. And so I think that what we'll see coming out of like Y20 is a lot of things that are geared specifically because we've got a theme of sustainability. We're going to be seeing a lot of policy decisions being made or policy proposals being put forward, where ultimately it's about how do we make sure that what we put in place can continue to leave a legacy, right? And we're going to use that wealth of experience that we've got in this country, being as diverse in terms of culture and language and ethnicity and way of thinking, right? We are a country that came out of a regime without having civil war, and that's nothing short of miraculous when you look at similar countries that have gone through regime across the world. I think that young people are mindful of that, even though that we are part of the born-free generation. So I definitely think that we recognize that in South Africa's place of privilege, we are in also a prime position to tackle issues that relate to us having problems back home, as well as trying to use the privileges that we do have internationally to alleviate problems abroad as well.
Now, as a young person, right, now we've spoken about this youth involvement, in the political life of the country. And I love how you mentioned that it starts from the grassroots level, because many times we look at politics and we just see it on this grand scale. And when people say they want to be involved in politics, they have great aspirations in politics, but we sometimes fail to understand that everything starts from the community. Now, as a young person yourself, how do you balance the desire you have for immediate action on issues like youth unemployment with this long-term constitutional goal of justice, equality, and inclusion?
You can't have the one without the other. Waiting for long-term change, these things don't happen because someone somewhere once decided that they want to revolutionize an entire system. what happens is you've got smaller efforts that build up until you've got something. It was like that before with apartheid, and people fought against it, and as they went, they were deterred at every turn that they made. And then it would have been convenient for them to give up and say, well, I'm not going to go through with it anymore, or what's the use of even trying? They doubled down and they said, we deserve better. I think that with our country, and yeah, I'm speaking about political culture again, we've got to come to a point where we look at the state of the country and move away from simply trying to get to a point where everyone can survive, and aim as well to have a country where everyone can thrive. Right? And I totally understand the fact that you've got to do both. And that's why I'm saying immediate action needs to also come in tandem with what the future goals will be. For instance, I understand we can't be doing certain things in this country while people are still living under the poverty line and struggling to survive. Those things need to be addressed immediately, right? But beyond that, there's also the fact that if we don't action something right now, we can't get to a point where we can eventually start working on the things that we hold dearer to ourselves. Right? And I mean, in terms of transformative constitutionalism, for example, we know that we've got a framework in our legal history coming into the new dawn of our republic back in '94 that aimed to alleviate poverty amongst majority of people in this country. I think that using the Constitution as our guiding principle, we should be looking to it for inspiration. Looking at the fact that while being measured doesn't mean that you give up on your dreams. It means action it out in a plan. When we're speaking about young people getting involved and doing small things like being kind to their neighbors, I'm not saying that to dismiss them or dissuade them from trying something bigger. I'm saying every small action will lead to something within the chain causing a bigger reaction. Right? People aren't going to take note of an issue sometimes unless you call for it. It might be intentional, or it might just be because things are so overwhelmingly busy. It means that while government is trying to put out fires that desperately need to be put out, we need to be at a place where we are also building on some of the other places where government hasn't yet been able to reach.
In his 2024 State of the Nation address last year, President Ramaphosa gave us the very well elocuted metaphor of Tintswalo. Now, Thaafir, Tintswalo would be 30 years old. Tintswalo would have lived through all of the major developments in our constitutional democracy, would have borne witness to the best of South Africa and the worst of South Africa. And Tintswalo now would be stepping away from the past and entering into a new future. Let's look at Tintswalo as a metaphor for the youth in general. To close, what message would you have for Tintswalo?
I would say to Tintswalo, the fact that people before us fought so hard to get us here doesn't mean that we shouldn't necessarily be relying on that same generation to take us forward. I think that each generation, whether they know it or not, has a mandate to take the environment to a certain point in history. And I think that the problem that we have now with our government is that we've got a generation of people that have just not realized that it is long past retirement for them. As young people, it's time for us to participate, to pick up the mantle and to take us to new places, never before imagined, using the tools that they have left behind. Also, happy 31st birthday, I would say, as well.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Thaafir Mustapha. Thaafir is a UCT law student and is the founder of SoWeVote, a very inspirational message from him today. Please like, share, and subscribe this podcast. You can find it on all of our social media pages. And stay tuned for another episode of the Constitution in Action podcast. Thank you.